Hey folks, Dr. Mike Israetel here for Lehman College this time. I am teaching a graduate course called Advanced Training Methods. This is a part of Dr. Brad Schoenfeld's master's program in, strength and hypertrophy, basically. So this course is designed for graduate students. So a couple of things. First, the strength component will be on YouTube available to everyone as long as that's okay. And there's a hypertrophy part of the course, part 2, which for the time being will not be available on YouTube because that's only available to folks who actually take the course, pay for the course, so on and so forth. Secondly, I will be answering no questions on YouTube about the course. That's what the actual course is for. If you're interested, give Lehman College a look, give the master's program a look. And if it's a course you want to take, awesome, we'll have you. We've got tests and quizzes and projects, and the students and I interact on a weekly basis, all questions answered, that whole situation. But the cool thing is, because of the internet, we're throwing this course up, at least part 1 of it, on YouTube for free for all the rest of you folks to see. This way, all of you folks that aren't in the course, you get a ton of value, but if you want a serious, complete value and a sort of complete look at the course, then you're probably going to want to give some thought to signing up for it. All right. Part 1. Part 2 is we're going to be going at a pretty good clip. There are some terms that will be defined. There are many terms that will not be defined. If you find that this is a very challenging material and I'm speaking too quickly or going from concept to concept too quickly, you need some more education before you're ready for a graduate level course. This is a grad level course. Now, if you can keep up and understand everything, you're doing really well for yourself, right? But this is a sort of a teaser and a sample. If you can't put this into context, a ton of other videos that I've put up should be a real good place for you to start. And eventually, you'll be able to make a whole lot of sense out of these. Lastly, if you're interested in taking your education to the next level, for the foreseeable future until they decide to fire me, I'm going to continue to teach this course for Lehman College. And the entire degree program there is essentially focused on strength and hypertrophy. A master's degree in getting strong and jacked sounds pretty cool to me. And I get to call myself a professor again with no hash quotes this time. So let's get into it. All right. So this is lecture number 1 about choosing strength exercises. Let's get right into it. What are we going to be talking about? So first, we have to define strength. So we're all on the same page. Second, we're going to talk about the supremacy of specificity and how that really unites all exercise selection and strength training. We're going to talk about the stimulus to fatigue ratio in the context of strength training, what it means, what it implies. We're going to talk about the role of specialized exercises that are not the core strength movements, where they belong, where they don't. And of course, talk about constraints that arise when you're training for competitive strength athletics versus just getting strong for a sport or just for recreation. So, defining strength is relatively easy. Strength is a skill. It is the skill of producing high levels of absolute force. It is can be defined in a couple of sub-ways, a little bit more specifically. For example, it can be maximal strength, which is a test usually of 1 repetition max. Can also be tested on a dynamometer of some kind, which is isometric. But in any case, the maximum ability to produce force for incredibly short duration, testing peak forces. It can be repetitive strength, which is usually up to about 6 reps of something, right? So if you can do a really, really heavy, really impressive set of 5 or 6, someone could say, wow, your rep strength is really amazing. Anything much over 6 reps, like if you're doing sets of 10 with a lot of weight, are you strong? Yes, totally. But that really in the literature starts to be termed strength endurance, which is a slightly different topic. Here we're concerned with strength. So it's 6 reps and less, and our sort of really key, most relevant, most unifying measure really is the 1 repetition max. How much can you lift once? Right? Really, really big deal. Now, a lot of times folks use the term resistance training synonymously with strength. We have to make sure that we don't do that. They're not synonymous at all. Because when you do resistance training, you can do it in a variety of rep ranges, variety of different cadences, variety of velocities. Not all of them intersect with strength. Resistance training can be done for an improvement in strength. So strength training is a subcategory of resistance training, but resistance training can also be done for size. Okay, bodybuilder doing sets of 20 is doing resistance training, training against resistance, but he's not really training for strength, right? Work capacity or even health, right? So people a lot of times say, what are the benefits of strength training for health? Sometimes they do really mean that, but often they just mean resistance training benefits for health. It's good to be really clear about that. So this course is about strength and hypertrophy training, not resistance training generally. That's undergrad stuff. Those days are gone. We're getting real specific. Now, because we're getting specific, we have to make sure to make another bifurcation. Strength and hypertrophy training are different. They have a lot in common, but strength training has a few more layers to it. So hypertrophy, I'm going to kind of read this backwards on the slides. Hypertrophy training has one goal. It is to increase muscle size. That's it. Like if muscle size is increased, you're winning, and that's all you care about. Someone could say, hey, you're getting a lot stronger, and if your biceps are way bigger, you're like, don't care, right? And that's totally cool. Strength training is significantly more complex. Muscle size plays a big role. So strength training, if it engages hypertrophy, it causes hypertrophy, that's usually a good thing, but we are looking for other things as well, including muscle architecture. The actual shape of the muscle internally changes a little bit during strength training, which aligns the force vectors better to produce exactly the force you need for the exercise you're doing, for the type of exertion you're doing. So the actual structure of your muscles changes, so even if they're the same size, they produce more force than they used to, which is really awesome. That's how come a lot of people practiced at one thing, like powerlifters. I mean, they might not look that jacked, but they're lifting weights that are really impressive for how jacked they look. Muscle architecture is a big deal. So is neural drive. Okay, your nervous system's ability to recruit the muscle and actually make it contract as hard as it can is absolutely trainable, independent of how big the muscle is. Huge part of strength training. Again, builds into that sort of weightlifter, powerlifter lore of like, how the heck is that guy lifting all that weight? That doesn't make any sense. Well, it does because their neural drive is super high. And lastly is technique. Okay, technique's a big deal with strength training. How to properly bench press for hypertrophy is real simple. You sort of move the weight up and down in a way that doesn't hurt your joints. Full range of motion, you're good to go. Like, you're going to have to use your pecs. For strength training, technique is really important, very specific. A properly executed competition bench, as you may well know, looks a little bit exotic, and there's a good reason for why it looks like that. So someone can take a person of the same exact muscle size, muscle architecture, neural drive, work on their technique for a few months, and their strength will go up. If you work on someone's technique, their hypertrophy might increase because you're able to better stimulate the muscle, but there's really no guarantee of that. So as you can see, strength and hypertrophy are two distinct concepts, which is why we've split this course into two very distinct parts. The first strength part and the second hypertrophy part. So for now, strength is our only concern. Now, as far as strength training is concerned, there are essentially at least two types. It's instructive to separate them into two types. There's what's called basic strength training, which we'll get into. We'll sort of build layers of content through this course as to why this is the best way to build strength. But basic strength is sort of strength that transfers to limit strength, which is how much weight you can lift once, and it transfers to repetitive strength pretty well, up to 6 reps. Basic strength training is usually done in the 3 to 6 rep range. Don't worry, we'll cover reps in much more detail in a few lectures. But 3 to 6 rep sets is essentially basic strength training, and limit or peaking strength training, depends on what you're peaking for, but something like powerlifting and weightlifting is sets of 1 to 3 reps. It's a little bit different. It probably doesn't build as much muscle, perhaps any. It might not do as much work to make you stronger, but more work to allow you to show off the underlying basic strength you kind of already have. So if basic strength training is like building the house's foundation and frame, peaking strength is kind of like making sure the windows are really pretty and the shades are up. It's not exactly going to move a huge needle there. It doesn't change the huge structure, but it absolutely enhances the presentation, which look, like nobody cares how basically strong you are in your own gym. If you show up to a meet and step on a powerlifting platform and you don't total what you're supposed to total, that is where limit strength comes in super handy. But for building strength, for increasing it over the long term, basic strength is probably the way to go. And we'll talk about that later in more depth. All right. Point number 2, specificity is supreme. Specificity literally is the single most important uniting principle of strength training. It's really simple to explain. You become better at what you train, or if you train the subsystems of whatever it is, then that thing becomes better. Okay? That's it. It's that simple. And if we're going to really define specificity, we have to get really particular. We could ask the question of like, what do you mean by strength, right? And strength is defined exactly based on how it is measured. So you could be defining strength as sets of 1, like 1 RM, limit strength, totally cool. If you define it as sets of 5, then your training has to be specific towards getting as good at sets of 5 in the long term as you can. A lot of times when people say who's stronger and comparing two lifters, you have to ask in what muscle groups and what movements. Are you trying to get stronger for barbell rows or overhead presses? Because the training is going to be very, very different for one or two of those, right? So we have to define it very specifically if we want to do the best job creating a program to increase whatever it is we want to increase. And before you start training for strength, you have to answer the question of strength in what, right? So it could be a number of options here. Is it a specific exercise, right? Are you doing the bench press competition or something like that? Then you care about your bench press going up. And if someone says, well, how's your incline dumbbell press? You can literally tell them, I don't care, right? And you would be completely justified in that answer. You could train for a range of general abilities for moderate reps. Strongmen are the best in the world at this. If you've got sets of 5 to 10 to do in any exercise in the gym, the strongman's going to beat everyone else at it. Because their events are rather unpredictable and they have to be strong all over, and they're often sort of moderate repetition events. You could train for all-around strength, and this is super, super common. For example, a full body program in the gym. Like some people in the gym go in there and they're like, I want to train for strength. I want to get stronger. And someone asked like, well, like for what muscles? And they're like, I don't know, kind of like all of them. And a lot of programs come stock like this. A program, very famous one called Starting Strength, is a really good example. That sort of hits all your body's major muscle groups and just gets you generally stronger. Nothing wrong with that. Very specific goal, but a lot of people have that goal. Of course, there is the very, very important thing we can't miss is strength training for another sport. Or a lot of times, for example, you want sprinters to increase their leg strength. If a sprinter has enormous arms and giant chest and back, and they're super strong bench pressers and they can bent row the world, it really doesn't matter that much. But leg strength matters a ton for sprinters. So for every sport, you're going to have to do a needs analysis to find out which muscle groups, when strengthened, impact performance the most, and then design your program from there, right? So when we really dig in at a graduate level of what is strength and what is strength training, it turns out it's pretty specific. And this is the kind of knowledge you need in order to build not good programs, but the best possible programs that you know how, right? Now, once you figure all this out, then whatever you figured out, let's say, okay, I want to get as good as possible at sets of 1 in the bench press. Then you train with that type of strength training / goal as your central organizing feature. Every part of your program, if I ask, why is that there? What is that? What is that doing? Why did you put that there? It all has to loop somehow without too many logical steps to increases my bench press 1RM or whatever goal you picked. Now, the cool thing is you can always switch your goal, right? That doesn't mean that every strength program you ever write is a 1RM bench program. You can always switch to something else. And so, for example, people will say in the gym, hey, I want to really get my bent row to increase. Cool. Strength program for your bent row for 2 months. And then afterwards, if your bent row has gone up and you're satisfied, you can be like, you know what? My shoulder press is kind of lagging. I want to increase that. You design a program a little bit more tailored to improve shoulder press strength, so on and so forth. All right. Next, very important concept here in this lecture. Strength SFR, stimulus to fatigue ratio, and what it implies. It implies a lot for exercise selection and strength training. So from the last slide or several slides, we know that proper exercise selection in strength training has to check a couple of boxes for us. First of all, it has to target the muscle groups used in our eventual outcome test for strength. Like if your pecs are super involved in bench pressing and you are bench pressing as a test of strength in 8 weeks and none of your strength exercises use the pecs, you have a serious problem in your program. Okay, pretty straightforward. We also want to make sure that not only are the muscles used, but they are limiting factors or can be limiting factors. For example, if you're saying, I want to really train my grip to get stronger grip, and one of the exercises you're using is pull-ups, someone can ask you the question, okay, so on this last set of pull-ups, why did you fail? Let's say you went all the way to 10 RPE, you couldn't do any more reps. And you would say, because my back, like my lats aren't strong enough to do any more reps. And someone could say, okay, how far away from failing are your forearm musculature is your grip? And you're like, I don't know. Like I could easily do double as long hanging there doing pull-ups and my forearms wouldn't be taxed. Okay. So your forearms are used but they're nowhere limiting factors in the exercise. That means they're not being pushed anywhere remotely near their physiological limits to have to get much stronger. Will they get stronger just from you hanging there? Sure, of course. But that's hardly the most optimal way to get them strong. If you use a pen, you write with a pen, it uses your forearm musculature, but like your forearms are not exactly a limiting factor of how much writing you're doing. It's usually like your brain or just annoyance. Like, I don't want to write anymore. Why do people use pens? It's 2020. Get a computer, right? So you can't exactly say that every time you use a muscle, you're training that muscle for strength. That means walking around, someone's like, what are you doing? You're like, training legs for strength. Like, you just walked up and down the block. I saw you do it. You're like, yeah. What do you think what muscles do you think I'm using? Like, what? Right? So, your quads are not a limiting factor for walking up and down the block. They have to be a limiting factor. If you want them to be stronger, the exercises that train them the best are going to be ones which push them close to their limits. It is because your quads couldn't perform another rep that the exercise could no longer continue, that sort of thing, right? Oftentimes, this means that the testing exercises themselves will be used for training. I mean, like, let's take a look at this. Bench press. Does the bench press use your pecs? Yes. Okay. Does the bench press push your pecs or to a limiting factor and push your triceps as a limiting factor and your front delts? Yes. So it's a great exercise for training itself. That's as basic as we can get in specificity, though I will say there will be a little bit of a complexity we introduce in just a little bit with that. But fundamentally, a lot of times, the most straightforward answer, and it's the correct answer a lot, is if I want to train for lift X, I'm going to do a whole lot of lift X because it checks all these boxes. Awesome. Right? So not only do we want the exercises to be stimulative, but we want them to be stimulative when we select them for strength increases. Okay. So the exercises thus must be limited by strength limiting factors. For example, if your weak link in the bench press is triceps, and you're doing a lot of wide grip pressing where the chest is the one that fails first, is it the ideal exercise? No, probably not. But if your weak link is triceps and you're doing lots of close grip benches where the triceps are really the weak link, then your triceps are going to get much stronger, and that'll probably transfer pretty well to increasing your regular competition bench. So that's a really, really good thing. Huge problem here that we could potentially run into, and because we're telling you this, you're going to avoid, and you probably already are, is to make sure that the muscles get a chance to contract hard, push themselves to their local limits, push the nervous system to its output limit in a stable environment. Instability, when you're wobbly, literally, your body has a defense mechanism against that, which is to reduce neural drive centrally. Okay? It's evolved from a variety of things, probably like stepping on a tree limb to try to get a piece of fruit. And as you step and you put weight down, the tree limb moves. Now look, you're out in the savannah, hospitals don't exist, doctors don't exist, all you got's your own healing abilities. If you had a wobbly tree limb, one fall and the tree limb breaks and you break your leg, man, you're done. Evolution's like, see ya. So evolution has done a really good job of making sure that if humans detect instability, not consciously, completely subconsciously, your central drive to really contract the muscles detecting it hard really, really reduces. Which means that if you try to stand up while you're on ice, you'll notice standing up is hard. You're like, whoa, holy crap, like I feel like I have to use more oomph to get up. But if you're standing up on a super high friction surface, you just come right up. So when we're training for strength, like if we're training for balance, hey, unstable it up. But when we're training for strength, you have to make sure that whatever implement you're using is as rock solid stable as possible, which means some implements are completely out. For example, wobble boards and Bosu balls. There's good research that I've been a part of directly myself at Appalachian State University that showed sometimes the 1 rep max you can generate on a wobble board and squatting is 60% of what it is in real life. Now, you guys are grad students. You know that in order to get stronger at the fastest rate, you got to be lifting at least 70% of your 1 rep max. 60% is like endurance work. So that's a 20. So we put those two together, 70% minimum force generation to get stronger. And all of a sudden your 1 rep max on a wobble board is 60% of what it is on a stable surface. Do you think your muscles and nervous system getting pushed to the edge? By definition, they can't be, right? It's literally just a balancing exercise. Like you see like a ridiculous silly clown with one of those giant umbrellas and the nose, like on the at the circus, balancing on something crazy, and you're like, bro, that clown is strong, man. You got to have a lot of strength to balance. Like, you got to have some, but the strong man at the circus is stronger than the clown, even if he can't balance. Don't be a clown. Don't use the wobble board for strength training. Now, some other lifts we can use in context, but they come with trade-offs and are maybe not ideal to use for especially limit strength, but even basic strength. Dips. Okay, if you're using dips, they're a little bit unstable, and some kind of close grip bench situation, maybe with a decline, would probably be more stable and let you put out more neural drive and get stronger. Dumbbells are not a great tool when they're pushed. When they're pulled, it's okay. One arm rows, if you have the 180s or whatever, you can rock on because there's no instability. Dumbbells, especially like an incline dumbbell press, somebody has to load it and you got to do this and then you got to do that. A lot of that force output is not as high as it could be. It would be higher on a barbell or on a Smith machine or something like that, where you can really focus on output versus stability. And so you have to make those trade-offs. But in any case, when the lift is stable, then it is usable to enhance strength. If it's not stable, to the extent that it is not stable, it is less and less usable to enhance strength, right? Now, lastly, the lifts you're using have to have a close muscular and technical execution. Don't have to, it's better when they are, to the actual tested movements. But of course, that includes the movements themselves. Because your nervous system learns to move you in a very particular way, even if you've managed to increase your chest strength a ton locally with chest flies, and a ton locally with, let's say, cable tricep extensions, those lifts, coordination-wise, technique-wise, the exact vectors of forces that they receive are so different from a bench press that it's going to take a while for you to realize the actual transfer of training from getting your pecs and triceps stronger in those very, very different lifts to actually getting them stronger in the bench press itself. So if you instead choose wide grip bench presses and JM presses, both chest exercises, just like the last two, but ones that are technically and mechanically very, very similar, then your ability to transfer strength is going to be that much greater. Now, so we want these exercises to check these boxes so they can be stimulative, increasing our ability to be strong. But that's only half the story of stimulus to fatigue ratio. Fatigue also matters. We can have excellent, super stimulative exercises, but some of them can mess up your joints and connective tissues much more than others. Like, you could be getting real strong doing low bar squats, but you're like, you know what, my elbows are killing me. And it's not an appropriate response to be like, whatever, bro, it's part of specificity. I don't know, man, that's a trade-off. If your elbows start hurting more and more and more, your rack position can change. Literally, your nervous system drive can decline because you're so attentive to the pain that you're not even attentive to the lift as much anymore. And you might be, the joint connective tissue problems can get so severe that it begins to prohibit you from training at all in that lift. And then what are you going to do, right? Especially, let's say you have 10 weeks out, you have a low bar squat competition, and at, week 1, you're already hurting in your elbows. You might not even make it to week 10. Maybe it's a good idea to save that for the last little bit and work on another exercise that has similar stimulus, but not as much fatigue to the joints and connective tissues. Another one is some exercises are psychologically or neurally more taxing than others. And that's good if they have the stimulus to come along with it. But it's not that great when the stimulus isn't really all that amazing. A really good example here, and many people have realized this in powerlifting over the years, high block pulls, like very, very partial reps, don't really transfer to the deadlift all that much, which is to say they're not very stimulative towards deadlift strength. They're decently, but not exceptionally. Deficit deadlifts are even more stimulative. Regular deadlifts, for sure, more stimulative. Stiff-legged deadlifts, very stimulative. High block pulls, stimulus is okay, but they are really taxing on the nervous system, really taxing on the psychology, because you have to amp up like crazy to pick up at 1,100 pounds. It's really, really tough. It fatigues you a ton, and you can't repeatedly do that week after week after week and get great stimuli. With that lift, you're not even getting great stimuli. You're getting a ton of fatigue for what ends up being decent stimulus. If you try another exercise that has more stimulus, maybe a little bit less fatigue, you're winning all around. It makes that exercise per any one session deliver more utility, make you stronger. And because the fatigue is lower, you can do it session after session after session for more sessions, load it more, and still continue to benefit much longer, right? So we're choosing strength exercises. We can't simply be concerned with the stimulus. We have to be concerned with exercises that give us the highest stimulus with the lowest fatigue, which is to say their stimulus to fatigue ratio is the highest possible, right? And we can do a quick checklist for SFR, so it's not a mystical quantity of like, okay, well, how do I know, right? We got a really quick couple of checklist items here. First of all, the exercise, and this is for strength, right? For hypertrophy, it would be different. The exercise is similar to the tested movement, or at least trains the same muscles. Check. Okay. Stimulative. The exercise can be safely loaded in the strength range. Okay. So like some exercises that are very isolation-y, gee, you don't want to do sets of 3 to 6 with them. Dumbbell flies with sets of 3 to 6. I don't know, man. I'd be a little bit scared about shoulder instability and so on and so forth. I'm personally never doing that. Feel free to try. Just kidding. Don't do that. Right. The joint and connective tissue fatigue that these exercises generate that we're looking at is not needlessly high. Like if you get off some kind of a movement with one set, a hard set of it that you chose for strength, and your joints and connective tissues are like, and you're like, what am I getting out of this movement that I wouldn't from others? And the answer is like, that's just another variation. It's not overly stimulative. Then by definition, the joint and connective tissue is literally needlessly high. And if you can justify it, if you have to do it for specificity, or if it's super, super stimulative and you're okay with the joint and connective tissue sort of taking the debit card to those, fine. But if there's really no justification, then right? If someone's like, hey, block pulls are amazing. You try block pull, your joints hurt a ton. And someone's like, but it's going to work a lot. And you're like, is it though? And then you might scrap that exercise altogether. Neuropsychological fatigue is not exceptionally high. Like a lot of people throw like 18 plates on a leg press and just go psychotic and do a couple of partial reps. That's a lot of fatigue. It's gonna drain you. And are you really getting a huge stimulus out of that? Well, partial leg presses don't really transfer to deep squats all that well. You might have to reconsider your choice. And super important, the exercise is progressively loadable for continuous stimulation. So for example, if you have a tire that you're doing tire flips with, it's a great test of strength. It's a great sort of exercise to sharpen your competitive skills at flipping the tire, but it's not a very good basic strength generation exercise because how do you load the tire? How do you add load to the tire? Ideally, you would add load by small fractions, which is why, weights, barbells, small plates are a real good tool in toolbox for strength enhancement, right? So if all of this is golden, you're doing a really high SFR exercise. If a lot of these things are like, nah, man, this sucks, then your exercises have low stimulus to fatigue ratio. You should probably choose some other exercises. Right? Now, what are the implications here of SFR? So for any given strength or outcome test that you're training for, you can rank order exercises for you, because this changes person to person, that have the highest or higher stimulus to fatigue ratios, right? Not too difficult to do, especially if you're an advanced thinker on the subject who've been training for a long time. Look, if this is your first time training, first of all, I have no idea why you're watching this video. You should have been training for a long time already, but you're going to have to figure out a lot out. But usually when I teach this concept of SFR, folks that have trained a while and thought about it, they're like, oh, duh. Like, of course that makes sense. And automatically I can be like, what are your highest SFR exercises for improving the squat? And they can be like, boom, 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 right? So here's an example, just for a certain individual going through their own little checklist here and ranking which exercises do best on that checklist, which ones do worse and worse and worse, and which ones are worst. Here are maybe some top SFRs. And here's where we introduce a little bit of complexity. This is grad level stuff, so bear with me. Number one, best SFR in this example for competitive bench press, competition setup, is a flat back bench press, different than competition. That's number one. Number two, competition bench press. All right, number two in its own category, not bad. It's like you do an award show at your own house for yourself and you take second place, your dog takes first, right? Number three, close and wide grip bench presses, tied for number three, pretty decent. Number four, incline bench. Notice that because the angle is so different from pressing, that we have a little bit less stimulus. The fatigue probably isn't terrible, but the transfer of training isn't as high. And then number five is dips and overhead presses. So when people say like, hey, are overhead presses good to bring up my bench? Like, yeah, potentially in context, but it's not exactly the first thing I would tell someone when I'm choosing exercises to increase their bench press. The first thing I would choose in this example is flat back bench press. Now, why? We got to answer this question. Why is the tested exercise itself in second place to itself? How does that happen? Right? Well, here's what the deal is. We're looking at stimulus to be able to increase the lift versus fatigue. Just as an example, someone could take a lot of fatigue arching their back because a good competition bench requires a really, your best possible arch. That can take a huge chronic fatigue toll, arching and arching and arching all the time. So that lowers SFR. And yeah, the stimulus might not be as high for a flat back bench, but the fatigue might be so much less that the stimulus to fatigue ratio is actually better, right? So in this case, if this is really our reality, but we're training for as big of a competition press as possible, we probably just train the flat back bench most of the time. And then, and we'll get to this much later in all the other lectures, we start threading in the competition bench later to actually get good at it when the test approaches. Voila, SFR in real life. Now, let's talk about how specialized exercises fit in, okay? Not every exercise has to directly stimulate all the muscles and replicate the basic movement used in the tested exercise, okay? You could do a dumbbell fly and someone's like, I thought you were training for bench press. And you're like, uh-huh. And they're like, but that's not a bench press and it's not even a press. Like, what are you doing? And it's a valid question and it has to have a valid answer, right? So first, some exercises might target specialized muscles or abilities that we need to bring up. For example, if you're struggling with lockouts in the bench, close grip bench might address that very well. Better than the regular bench, maybe. Back strength in the deadlift, because the deadlift tests all kinds of strength. Maybe you can use something like a flexion row in order to improve spinal erector strength for the deadlift, maybe. Okay. Core stability for the overhead press may actually be improved with machine crunches. If your abs get really, really strong doing, lame machine crunches, your overhead press can actually go up because it turns out your limiting factor was your core the whole time. Your upper body was nice and strong. As soon as you're able to create a nice, good, rigid posture, you're like, oh my God, my overhead press went up. So it's definitely possible. And another example is staying upright in the squat, a good morning. Like you show a good morning to someone as an assistance exercise, a specialized exercise for squat improvement. And, if they're not really familiar with the strength training science, they haven't thought about it much, they're like, but you're not even using your legs. You're just like bending over. As a matter of fact, you don't even want to bend over on the squat that much because then you're doing it wrong, right? Like, what is that? That's like training, like being a boxer and training to take punches to the face. You're not supposed to be punched in the face. You're messing up if that's the case, right? But what it does is it trains the muscles and movements that allow you to stay upright under heavy loads and thus use your legs, stay mechanically advantageous, and use more weight, right? So it is a role for that exercise, even though it's a good example, actually, good mornings, of something that really only tangentially looks related to squatting, but in fact can produce really, really big returns, right? So strength improves, remember, by training the exercise, a similar one, or by subsystems, which a lot of the specialized exercises actually train the subsystems, the sub-muscles, the sub-movements that actually make that tested exercise as high as it can possibly be. Now, when do we give the check mark to use specialized exercises and when do we not? Okay, really, really important points here. So when is it okay? The all clear is given to use specialized exercises. First of all, when you can justify their subsystem as supportive of tested exercise. Like you're bench pressing, you're training for bench press, and you're doing hamstring curls. And someone's like, what you doing that for? You're like, it improves my bench. You're like, how? And you're like, you wouldn't understand, bro. Doesn't work. Makes no sense. Okay? Has to be like the front delts or the chest or the triceps. Or if you get really creative, your biceps. Who knows? But it's got to make sense. Okay? Those actual subsystems have to support what you're doing. Otherwise, why are you doing it, right? Next, they have to have a high SFR, period. As high of an SFR as possible, right? So if something has a really terrible stimulus to fatigue ratio, I probably wouldn't use it. And here's a really deep point, kind of graduate level point. Doing them is time spent better than doing general exercises, okay? And it's often the case when the specialization exercise hits the very, very limiting factor of an exercise. For example, if you are a really, really good bench presser and your pecs are enormous and super strong and your triceps are like, you're going to get in a situation where a lot of times the lockout is by far the hardest part. And every time you train the bench press, let's say for 4 weeks, good regular bench press training, your triceps get N units of stimulus, right? And only like towards the end and only like sort of halfway the lockout, your triceps are getting decent stimulus, but your pecs are getting huge stimulus too, so on and so forth. So the systemic load, systemic fatigue is pretty high, but you get a decent tricep stimulus. Now, how about this? We start doing JM presses, maintenance volume for the bench press. And then we do JM presses, which are like modified skull crushers, where it's sort of an exact hybrid of skull crushers and close grip benching. Okay. So you're doing JM presses. Now, what fraction of the exercise of JM presses stimulates the triceps? 100% of it. Okay, that means the stimulus is not N, it's maybe 2N. Okay, so over the course of 4 weeks of bench training, you may get 4N tricep stimulus just from regular benching, even though they're the limiting factor. 4 weeks of JM presses with just a little bit of benching thrown in, so it doesn't get worse, may give you 8N stimulus, or maybe 6N if it's really not that good. Still more. So your time spent doing more JM presses increased your bench press more than just bench pressing more often. That's what it means when it says it's time better spent than doing general exercise. So check this out. If you just bench pressed and your bench press went up by 20 kilos, maybe not over a month, just an example, and then you do a cycle where, okay, my triceps are weak, I'm going to do lots of close grip benches and jam presses, and then your bench only goes up by 15 kilos, you have some questions to answer, right? Why do you do these specialized exercises when you could just do the regular movement and be 100% fine, better than 100% fine? You could do your best possible. Specialized movements really, really argue for themselves when a cycle or two of doing them brings up your competition lift more than it would be brought up if you were just doing it. That's a real selling point. Now, let's take a look at when they're not okay to use, or in other words, we don't want to be pedantic here, not recommended, okay? First, if they don't meet all of the above conditions, if they, for example, aren't a limiting factor, have a low SFR, so on and so forth, you got an argument on your hands. Second, this is really, really big point. You're doing them because you think they have some sort of magic effect. Okay, people do this all the time. They watch a super famous powerlifter do some kind of assistance lift, and they look at it on YouTube and they're like, oh, sweet, I'm going to do that. And you go, why? Because they're big and strong and they do it. Oh, holy crap. Well, yeah, that's real high level thinking. You should be a computer scientist or something. You should be launching, step aside, Elon Musk. Here come you, electric car, hold my beer. Mars, we're going to Mars, baby. It's ridiculous, okay? You're strength training for your body and its limits, not someone else's. That exercise could make a lot of sense for them. It wouldn't make any sense for you. Or it could, but you have to do your own analysis, right? So a lot of times this comes with a question. That's point number 3. Like, hey, should I be doing dips for bench? Well, easy question. Are your triceps holding you back? No. Then no, probably not. I mean, you could still do them, and they might still have some sort of yield. But replacing the dips with another exercise, let's say your pecs are really holding you back, doing fewer dips and more wide grip bench presses, which train your pecs a lot, could increase your bench more, right? So it has to be justified. We do not use specialized exercises willy-nilly. Like everything else in our plan, there has to be a good reason, and not just a good reason, a reason that's better than it is for all the other competing exercises you could be doing. Now, second to last point, or last main point before we do a quick review. Competitive constraints are a real big deal. What the heck does that mean? So if you're training athletes for strength, for their sport, and their sport is not weightlifting or powerlifting itself, or strength itself, specificity is pretty lenient. Okay, any high SFR general strength exercise is awesome. So if you're training sprinters to have stronger legs, and I see you using a buffalo bar squat or a safety squat, I'm not going to be like, what? You're not doing low bar? That's insane. Like, does the safety squat stimulate, lower body extension very well? Yes. Is it stable? Oh yeah. Golden. Okay. You could just never actually do a barbell squat ever for sprinters. You could only do safety squats and you'd be super fine. The other way around. Awesome. Right. So not as lenient. Now, on the other hand, if you're training athletes to get strong at a specific exercise, then specificity is quite strict. So for example, a lot of your actual training might be that exercise itself. So for weightlifting, you're going to do a lot of snatches and clean and jerks. Not all snatches and clean and jerks, but a whole lot of them. Powerlifting, you're going to do the competition lifts a whole lot because they pass all the muster and they have the best SFRs and so on and so forth. And you have to get good at them. You got to train them eventually. In addition to that, if you're training for a very specific strength lift, a lot of your training could be a very narrow range of very similar exercises that all have the best SFRs and best transfers of training, right? As a weightlifter, you might do for your quads, squats, front squats, overhead squats, although those aren't really for your quads, and then maybe belt squats. And that's it, like literally it. Maybe not even belt squats. Like most weightlifters do squats or front squats, and that's all they do for quads. Because any other exercise wouldn't have as good of an SFR, mostly because on the stimulus side, it just doesn't transfer to the weightlifting movements nearly as well, right? And no matter what sort of trade-off of specificity and variation you choose, anytime you train for competition in a strength lift, you have to increase the amount of lift used as the competition gets closer. Absolutely. So you're employing more of the competitive exercise and usually fewer specialized exercises. The beginning of a training plan for powerlifting could be doing lots of JM presses, lots of close grip bench, lots of wide grip bench. A few weeks out or a few days out, you're going to be doing almost exclusively the competition bench and very little else. Okay? So an example here, choosing a main heavy leg exercise. If you have a sprinter, in mesocycle 1, they can use a high bar squat. Mesocycle 2, they can use a safety squat. Mesocycle 3, they can use a front squat. No big deal. All of those are great exercises for general strength development in the lower body. Question there about variation if it's too high, but we'll save that for a later discussion. For a powerlifter, first meso can be high bar squat. Second meso, low bar squat, because that's what we're competing in. Third meso, low bar squat again. Quite more monotonous, but that's part of the trade-off of making sure you're trying to get good at one lift. All right, some closing remarks. First, strength is the skilled ability to produce force. Very easy definition. It doesn't just involve muscle size. It involves muscle size, architecture, neural, and technical factors, all of which have to be addressed in a comprehensive program, and we'll make sure to do that. Training for it must define it very specifically. You never just say, I just want to get strong. You have to answer strong at what and how. How are you going to show off? So we make sure you're the best that you can be. Exercises used in strength training are usually going to be very similar to the tested ones and or train the components of the tested exercises, that the components muscularly or technically that contribute to those tested exercises. We're going to train them hard, right? Not just train them, okay? Grip is not trained very well for most people in pull-ups. It has to be a dedicated grip exercise that pushes the forearms to the limits. You're going to choose about your exercises through stimulus to fatigue ratio as a huge, huge choice. Top choices always win. We're going to talk about variation later in its own discussion as to when you sort of step away from one exercise and go to another. By the way, the answer to that is also SFR. We'll get to that. Specialized exercises are totally cool to use, but they have to be training limiting subsystems of the actual lift and not just random stuff. And they have to be justified. You don't just use them because you saw someone using them. You have to justify them in the context of the needs of your specific program, your specific abilities, your specific body. And competition and the nature of competition determines the stringency of specificity. If you're training people for general strength, like someone is a wrestler and they just want to get stronger on the mat, there's tons of exercises you can use that are very, very good. If you're training a weightlifter, there are a handful of exercises that are the best, and every other exercise just doesn't compare, right? Next time, that's it for this lecture, we're going to talk about, now that we know what exercises to pick, how to choose the loads for those exercises to optimize our strength program. Folks, see you in the next lecture.